In this video, I'll be demonstrating what this dashboard is and how I used VBA and macros to help me automate the process of creating this each week. This report shows the current bookings within the quarter. I've generated different slicers so that the team can flip through the different views that they request. The bottom left table is more of a high-level overview, whereas the table on the right gives more of an order-level detail. This report is going to be updated and published each week since the bookings are going to be changing as deals come in throughout the quarter. So each week, I'm going to be updating the data I found here in this flat pivot table because all these tables here are pulling from this data. So I'm going to have to go in and pull the most recent data, input it into this tab, and then update the charts here. So here's my bookings data dump. Now, my particular business unit is only concerned with sales of a certain product type and a sales type. So I noticed that my colleagues would always have to pivot out this unwanted data. So what I did was create different macros to automatically pivot that data out and create, the different fields that we are actually concerned with. So in the Developer tab, under my macros, I have a macro called pivot OBIE. So I'm just going to run this pivot and this macros, and you'll see that it'll create a pivot table. Now I have a separate macros to adjust how this pivot table looks. For some reason, it didn't really agree when I tried to combine these two macros together. So my workaround was just to create two different macros. So I'm going to run this edit pivot macro that will arrange the pivot table in the way that we'd like to see the data. So now our pivot table is organized in a way that we can clearly see the data. Some of these order numbers had multiple lines, and so I created the pivot so that each order number would just have one booking amount. So now I want to be able to manipulate the data in the pivot table. So what I'm going to do is copy and paste the values right on into the same worksheet. And I'll just delete these 3 rows. And I have a third macro here that's going to remove all the blanks, all the zeros, and the blank cells in the revenue column, because those are just junk rows. So I'm going to run that. And now we can see that the booking revenue is all dollar values. There's no zeros or blanks. So we've cleaned up this data. So now the data is ready to be copied and pasted back into the bookings report. So what I'm going to do is just copy all of this. I hit Control-Shift down to get to the bottom of my data set. I'm just going to copy this. And in my bookings report, I'll go into the flat pivot and just paste these values to replace the old data. So I just want to make sure that there's no lines from the old data still there. And I just want to show these 2 columns that I've had to manually add to this table. The team likes to see data in millions, so this here is just to convert the dollars into these units, these million units. And the second column here is to reference which sales rep is working on this opportunity. So how I did that was there's another tab in here called Worldwide Rep Mapping. And the way that the reps are mapped are by state, if it's within the US, or by country. So what I have here is just a table that our ops team was able to provide. And what I did here is I did a if statement, a VLOOKUP embedded in an if statement that says if the country name is United States, look up the state in the mapping tab. Otherwise, you can just look up the country name. So this grabs the rep name that's going to be used in our booking summary in those slicers. So once I have all of that complete, I just go into the booking summary and I can right click and hit refresh. Now nothing's going to change because it's actually the same data dump that I used. However, if I go into here and I just change one of these values, I'll make this 2 million instead of 1 million. And if we go back into the booking summary and now I hit refresh, we'll be able to see that that changes to 17 million instead. So now I'll take you to this forecast versus plan tab. So what the sales team wants to see is the current bookings that we've already captured and also see what the forecast will be. They have a tool called salesforce.com, which I'll now unhide, which lists all the different opportunities and all the different forecast categories, whether it be a realistic, meaning they're really sure that the deal will be coming in this quarter, to best case, which is like a 50-50 chance, to unqualified. And so what they want to be able to see is how many deals do they have under commit status, and they want to be able to add that to what's currently booked to get a real gauge of what they can expect to be at the end of the quarter. So what this is here, it's just broken down by geos again, and I've put in if statements, some if statements here. So for example, this equation is saying if the opportunity is within the Americas and it's also in commit, then I want that, and sum the AA products from that column. And I do that for all the other types of opportunities, for realistic deals and best case. And so at the end of the day, their projected bookings will be this number here, which is what's already come in, what's already been booked, plus the really high probability deals that they're expecting to come in. And just for their reference, they have this best case here, which is more or less like a 10% chance that those deals will come in, just in case they want to see that as well. So what I want to mention is that this Salesforce.com table that I have here is actually pulled from another report that somebody else creates from a different team. And so what I do, so let me just pull that up. This is the table that I copy into my bookings sheet. However, we don't want to include anything that says renewal, that has a renewal here. I'll just zoom in here. And so what I was finding was, we would have to sort this and then, manually delete those renewal lines. However, I was able to create a macros to automatically do that as well. So if I go to the developer tab in the macros and run this macro called test, you'll see that all these renewal lines will disappear. And so once I run that macro, I'll copy and paste this data into this Salesforce.com tab in my bookings proposal. And that will automatically generate these numbers here, which pull from this tab. So the hardest part about creating this dashboard was actually developing that macros to create the pivot table from the data dump. The first thing I had to manipulate was the reference to the last row of the data dump. Since the data will have a different number of rows each time, this can't be a static number. I did a little research and learned that if you define a variable called final row and give it these parameters, we can use this variable to determine the last row of the data, regardless of how many rows there are. So if you'll see that we reference final row here as well, just so that the code will know that not to use the final row of that initial data dump, but the final row of whatever data that you input in the sheet. Also, we had to create two variables called data sheet and new sheet here, which are used to reference the new sheet where the pivot table will be created. Again, we need to create these in order for the code to be run on any other data that may have different sheet names. Using VBA and macros will really help me expedite the process of producing this report moving forward. Thank you for listening, and hopefully this was useful for you as well.